The vast Montana prairie stretched endlessly under a copper sunset, where buffalo grass bent to winds that carried both promise and peril across a land that forgave no mistakes. This was 1889, when the frontier claimed lives as easily as it granted. Fortunes where survival depended more on courage than comfort, and where the strength of strangers could mean the difference between life and death. Here, beneath skies so wide they seemed to swallow human dreams whole, one woman would discover that sometimes salvation comes not from those who share your blood, but from those who recognize the sacred in your struggle. Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Catherine Wells, a 23-year-old woman whose husband's death left her 8 months pregnant and utterly alone on a homestead claim that suddenly felt more like a grave than a home. When her late husband's brother arrived with legal papers and cruel intentions, Catherine faced a choice that would test everything she believed about family, faith, and the kindness of strangers. But what happens when the very people society teaches you to fear become the ones who save your life? What happens when abandonment in the wilderness leads not to death, but to the most profound spiritual awakening imaginable? Catherine Wells pressed her swollen hands against the rough wooden windowsill of the tiny homestead cabin, watching the dust cloud grow larger on the horizon. 8 months pregnant and moving carefully, she recognized the approaching wagon even at this distance. The black paint and formal construction could only belong to one person, Harold Wells, her late husband's older brother, whose letters over the past month had grown increasingly demanding about her plans for the homestead claim. Thomas had been dead for 6 weeks now, claimed by a fever that had swept through the scattered settlements like wildfire, leaving widows and orphans in its wake. Catherine had nursed him through 5 days of delirium before the sickness took him, whispering promises about their unborn child and the life they would build together on this quarter section of Montana prairie. Now those promises felt like echoes in an empty house, beautiful but impossible to grasp. The morning Thomas died, Catherine had written the Herald, announcing the death and requesting guidance about managing the homestead claim during her pregnancy. She had expected sympathy, perhaps an offer of temporary assistance until the baby arrived. Instead, Harold's response had been swift and businesslike. The claim belonged to the Wells family, not to a widow with no blood ties to their name. He would arrive within the month to assess the property and make arrangements for its proper management. Catherine had read that letter dozens of times, searching for warmth or compassion that simply wasn't there. Harold had never approved of Thomas's marriage to a woman whose family had no land or money to contribute to the union. Their father had built a modest cattle operation across 3 homestead claims, and Harold viewed every decision through the lens of family property and reputation. A pregnant widow represented liability rather than family. The wagon drew close enough now for Catherine to see Harold's stern profile beside a younger man she didn't recognize. They moved with purpose rather than sympathy, their approach suggesting business rather than condolence. Catherine smoothed her black mourning dress over her pregnant belly and prepared to defend the only home she had ever truly loved. Harold Wells climbed down from the wagon with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to authority. At 45, he possessed the weathered confidence of someone who had survived 20 years of frontier ranching through careful calculation and strategic alliances. His companion, introduced as Daniel Morrison from the county land office, carried a leather portfolio that likely contained documents Catherine suspected would not work in her favor. "Catherine," Harold began without preamble, his tone suggesting this was business rather than a family visit. "I trust you've had time to consider your situation and make practical decisions about your future." Catherine invited them inside, though the cabin's single room felt cramped with 3 adults and the tension that Harold brought with him. The space that had felt cozy when shared with Thomas now seemed to emphasize her isolation. Everything In the room spoke of a life interrupted. Thomas's work clothes still hanging on pegs, his books stacked beside their bed, the cradle he had been carving for their baby still unfinished on the table. "I've been managing the homestead according to Thomas's plans," Catherine replied carefully. "The claim requires continuous residence for 5 years to achieve full ownership. I intend to fulfill those requirements." Harold's expression suggested he had expected this response and prepared for it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He gestured to Morrison, who opened his portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. "The homestead law contains provisions for situations like yours, Catherine. A woman in your condition cannot reasonably maintain the agricultural and improvement requirements necessary for a valid claim." Morrison spread the papers across Catherine's kitchen table, pointing to specific passages with practiced efficiency. Federal regulations require productive use of homestead land through farming or ranching operations. A pregnant woman, especially one without male family support, cannot establish the agricultural productivity necessary to maintain a valid claim. Catherine studied the documents, recognizing legal language designed to exclude women from independent land ownership despite the homestead law's apparent gender neutrality. The requirements for agricultural productivity, property improvements, and continuous residence created barriers that were difficult for any single person to meet, nearly impossible for a pregnant woman to achieve alone. "What exactly are you proposing?" Catherine asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Harold's proposal proved even worse than her expectations. He would assume control of the homestead claim through legal guardianship provisions that treated widows as dependents, requiring male oversight. Catherine would be permitted to remain on the property as a tenant, helping with domestic duties while Harold managed the agricultural operations. After the baby's birth, they would assess whether continued residence served the family's interests. "You're talking about taking my home," Catherine said quietly, her hands moving protectively to her pregnant belly. "Everything Thomas and I built together. I'm talking about ensuring family property remains productive rather than being lost." "Through inexperience," Harold replied with practiced patience. "You have no knowledge of cattle ranching, no experience with crop management, no understanding of the business relationships necessary for successful homesteading. Without guidance, you'll lose everything anyway." Morrison added supportive comments about the practical challenges facing single women on frontier homesteads, citing statistics about abandoned claims and failed agricultural ventures. His role was clearly to provide official legitimacy for Harold's family power grab, using government regulations to achieve what simple greed could not accomplish alone. Catherine requested time to consider their proposal, knowing she needed space to think clearly about options that all seemed to lead toward dependency and loss of autonomy. Harold agreed to return in 3 days for her decision, though his manner suggested the outcome was predetermined regardless of her preferences. After they left, Catherine sat alone in the cabin that suddenly felt more like a prison than a home. The legal documents spread across her table represented systematic exclusion, disguised as protection, family obligation disguised as theft. Everything Thomas had worked to build, every dream they had shared about raising their child on land they owned, was being stripped away through bureaucratic manipulation. That evening, Catherine walked the boundaries of her homestead claim, noting the improvements Thomas had made over 2 years of backbreaking work. The well he had dug by hand, the barn he had built from timber cut in the distant mountains, the fields he had cleared and planted with such hope for their future. Every fence post and furrow represented his vision of a life worth building, a legacy worth leaving for their child. The sunset painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson, reminding Catherine why Thomas had chosen this particular quarter section despite its distance from established settlements. The rolling grassland stretched toward mountains that seemed close enough to touch, creating a sense of space and possibility that neither of them had ever experienced in their cramped childhood homes. This was the landscape where they had planned to raise their child with room to grow and freedom to dream. Standing in the middle of the land that legally belonged to her, but practically would be stolen by morning, Catherine felt the baby move strongly inside her. The child seemed to respond to her emotional distress with increased activity, as if sensing the uncertainty about their future home and security. She placed both hands on her belly and whispered promises that felt impossible. To keep about safety and belonging and a place to call their own. 3 days later, Harold returned with additional documentation and 2 ranch hands, whose presence suggested he expected potential resistance to his legal guardianship arrangement. Catherine had spent those days researching her options, writing letters to distant relatives who might offer assistance, and calculating her meager financial resources against the costs of legal challenges she could not afford. Her research had confirmed Harold's assessment of her legal position. Homestead law, while theoretically available to women, contained practical requirements that effectively excluded pregnant widows from independent land ownership. The continuous residence requirement meant she could not leave to give birth in a town with medical assistance. The agricultural productivity requirement meant she needed to maintain farming or ranching operations beyond her physical capabilities. The property improvement requirements meant she needed to invest money and labor she did not possess. "I cannot accept your guardianship arrangement," Catherine told Harold directly, knowing her refusal would trigger consequences she was not prepared to handle. "I will find another way to maintain the homestead claim." Harold's response revealed the extent of his planning and the ruthlessness of his character. If Catherine refused his protection, she would face the harsh realities of frontier life without family support. He would not provide financial assistance, medical care during childbirth, or help with property management. More significantly, he would ensure that neighboring ranchers understood that Catherine Wells was not part of the Wells family business network, effectively isolating her from the community relationships necessary for survival. "You're choosing pride over practicality," Harold said with cold finality. "When winter comes and you're struggling to feed yourself and a baby, remember that you had family willing to help." The ultimatum carried implications beyond immediate hardship. Harold's influence in the county could affect everything from credit arrangements to emergency assistance, creating systematic isolation that would force Catherine to accept his terms or abandon the homestead entirely. His strategy was to make independent survival impossible while maintaining the appearance of offering reasonable family support. Catherine's refusal triggered immediate consequences. Harold and his ranch hands loaded their wagon with tools, equipment, and supplies that Thomas had borrowed from family resources during their marriage. They took the milk cow that had provided Catherine's primary source of protein, claiming it belonged to Wells family livestock rather than homestead property. Most significantly, they took the horses that Catherine needed for transportation and communication with distant neighbors. Watching them drive away with resources essential for survival, Catherine understood the full scope of her situation. She was 8 months pregnant, alone on a remote homestead, without reliable transportation or communication with potential helpers. Her food supplies would last perhaps 6 weeks if carefully rationed. Her firewood supply was adequate for autumn, but would not sustain her through a Montana winter. Most critically, she was facing childbirth without medical assistance or even female companionship. The cabin felt different after Harold's visit, charged with the reality of genuine isolation rather than chosen solitude. Every creak of wind through the walls reminded Catherine that she was miles from the nearest neighbor, days from the nearest town, weeks from any form of professional medical care. The baby's increasingly active movements served as constant reminder that her situation would become desperate long before winter's full arrival. That night, Catherine took inventory of her resources with the methodical attention of someone whose Survival depended on accurate assessment rather than optimistic thinking. Her food supplies included flour, dried beans, preserved vegetables from their summer garden, and salted meat Thomas had prepared before his illness. Carefully rationed, these provisions might sustain her for 6 to 8 weeks, assuming she could supplement them with eggs from their chickens and whatever wild food she could gather safely. Her financial resources consisted of $47 in paper money and coins, enough to purchase basic supplies, but not enough to hire help or maintain the homestead through winter. Thomas had invested their savings in livestock and equipment that Harold had claimed, leaving Catherine with minimal cash reserves at the moment when money had become essential for survival. Most problematically, Catherine possessed limited practical knowledge about homestead management beyond the domestic skills Thomas had not expected her to need. She could cook, preserve food, and maintain their household, but she had never managed livestock, repaired equipment, or handled the agricultural operations necessary for homestead compliance. Thomas had planned to teach her these skills gradually, assuming they would have years to develop her frontier capabilities together. The following morning brought the first hint of autumn in air that carried a sharper edge and leaves that showed touches of gold among the green. Montana's growing season was ending, and Catherine faced the reality that she would need to prepare for winter while dealing with advanced pregnancy and eventual childbirth. The timing seemed designed to make survival impossible, as if nature itself conspired with Harold's manipulation. Catherine spent that day walking her property boundaries again, this time looking for resources she might have overlooked during their comfortable years when Thomas handled all outdoor responsibilities. She identified edible plants that grew wild in their pasture areas, noting their locations and abundance for future gathering. She found a creek that ran through the far corner of their claim, providing reliable water even if their hand-dug well failed during winter freezing. More significantly, Catherine discovered evidence of previous habitation that she and Thomas had never fully explored. Near the creek, partially hidden by brush growth, stood the remains of what appeared to be a much older dwelling. The construction style looked different from typical homestead cabins, suggesting it might have been built by the original inhabitants of this land before white settlement pushed them westward. The structure consisted of partially collapsed wooden framework covered with what appeared to be hide and bark materials, creating a shelter design Catherine had never seen before. Inside the ruins, she found evidence of careful construction: fire-hardened wooden supports, ingenious water drainage systems, and storage areas designed to protect food and supplies from both weather and animals. Whoever had built this dwelling possessed sophisticated knowledge about surviving Montana winters in ways that Catherine's homestead cabin did not. Standing among these ruins, Catherine felt the presence of previous lives lived successfully on this same land. Someone had thrived here before white homesteaders arrived with their legal claims and agricultural requirements. Someone had understood how to work with the landscape rather than against it, finding abundance where Catherine saw only challenging isolation. That evening, as Catherine prepared a simple meal from her dwindling supplies, she found herself thinking about the unknown. People who had created the dwelling by the creek. Their construction methods suggested permanent residence rather than temporary camping, implying a deep understanding of local conditions and resources. Perhaps most importantly, they had succeeded in raising families on this land without the agricultural and legal frameworks that were making Catherine's survival so difficult. The baby moved restlessly that night, seemingly responding to Catherine's stress about their uncertain future. She lay awake listening to prairie winds that carried scents of changing seasons and distant sounds she could not identify. Coyotes called from the hills, their voices mixing with the whisper of grass and the creak of cabin timbers, in ways that emphasized both the beauty and the danger of her isolated situation. 2 weeks passed with Catherine struggling to maintain basic homestead operations while managing the increasing demands of late pregnancy. She had learned to care for their remaining chickens, whose eggs provided essential protein, and had gathered wild foods to supplement her stored provisions. The physical demands of these tasks left her exhausted each evening, but she was surviving and learning capabilities she had never expected to need. The challenge of firewood presented Catherine's most serious long-term problem. Thomas had cut and split enough wood to last through early winter, but Montana's harsh climate would require significantly more fuel than their current supply provided. Catherine lacked both the physical strength and technical knowledge to fell trees safely, especially in her pregnant condition. Without adequate heating fuel, the cabin would become uninhabitable long before spring's return. Catherine had also discovered the complexity of homestead law compliance during Thomas's absence. Federal regulations required continuous agricultural productivity, but she lacked the knowledge and equipment to maintain their small grain fields or manage livestock operations. Harold's removal of their horses and cow had eliminated her ability to perform the work necessary to keep their homestead claim valid under government oversight. More immediately, Catherine faced the approaching reality of childbirth without medical assistance or even female companionship. Her baby was due within 4 to 6 weeks based on her calculations, and she had no plan for managing labor and delivery alone. The nearest town with a doctor was 3 days' travel by wagon, impossible to reach once labor began. Even the closest neighbors lived too far away to summon quickly during a medical emergency. Each evening, Catherine studied the medical books Thomas had brought from his family's collection, searching for information about childbirth that might help her survive delivery without professional assistance. The books contained detailed anatomical descriptions and theoretical discussions about medical procedures, but little practical guidance for a woman facing labor alone. Most medical literature assumed the presence of trained physicians or experienced midwives rather than addressing solitary childbirth. The isolation that had felt romantic during their happy marriage now threatened Catherine's life in concrete, measurable ways. Every aspect of homestead survival required knowledge, equipment, or assistance that she lacked. The legal framework that was supposed to protect her property rights instead created requirements she could not meet alone. The family obligations that should have provided support had become instruments of manipulation and abandonment. Standing at her cabin window each evening, watching the sun set over prairie that stretched beyond the horizon, Catherine faced the most fundamental questions about survival and belonging. Could she find a way to raise her child safely on land that legally belonged to her, but practically remained beyond her ability to manage? Could she discover resources and assistance that would allow her to maintain independence without sacrificing safety? Could she transform from a dependent wife into a self-sufficient frontier woman before winter made such transformation impossible? The answers to these questions lay somewhere in the vast landscape surrounding her cabin, among people and possibilities she had yet to encounter. But time was running short, and the approaching Montana winter would test everything Catherine thought she knew about courage, survival, and the kindness of strangers in ways she could never have imagined when she first called this beautiful, dangerous place home. October arrived with a vengeance that Catherine had not anticipated, bringing temperatures that dropped below freezing at night and winds that cut through her wool coat like it was made of cotton. The baby had grown so large that simple tasks, like splitting kindling or carrying water from the well, left her breathless and aching. Each morning brought new evidence that winter was approaching faster than her preparations could match. The first crisis came when Catherine discovered that their grain storage had been compromised by mice that had chewed through the cloth sacks Thomas had used to store wheat and oats. Nearly half of her winter food supply lay scattered across the root cellar floor, contaminated beyond salvaging. The loss represented weeks of meals she could not replace, forcing her to recalculate her survival timeline from months to mere weeks. Catherine spent 3 days attempting to repair the damage, constructing mouse-proof containers from materials she found around the homestead. The physical demands of this work, combined with her advanced pregnancy, left her exhausted and concerned about the baby's well-being. Each night she felt fewer movements from the child, as if her stress and fatigue were affecting the life growing inside her. The isolation that had seemed manageable during summer's abundance became crushing as autumn stripped the prairie of its gentle warmth. Catherine had not spoken to another human being in over a month, and the silence was beginning to affect her mental state in ways she had not expected. She found herself talking aloud to the baby, to their chickens, to Thomas's memory, simply to hear a human voice in the overwhelming quiet. News of the outside world came only through week-old newspapers that the postal carrier left at a road marker 3 miles from her homestead. These trips to collect mail became increasingly difficult as her pregnancy advanced, but they provided her only connection to events beyond her immediate survival concerns. Through these papers, Catherine learned that early winter storms had already struck the northern territories, suggesting that Montana's harsh season would arrive sooner than usual. The postal carrier, an elderly man named Chester who had been delivering mail across the territory for 15 years, expressed growing concern about Catherine's situation during their brief encounters at the road marker. He had known Thomas and respected the young couple's determination to build a life on challenging frontier land. Chester's warnings about winter preparations carried the weight of someone who had seen homesteaders fail when they underestimated Montana's climate. During their last meeting in late October, Chester made an offer that both touched and terrified Catherine. His route included several established ranches where families might welcome a pregnant woman needing assistance through winter months. He could arrange temporary residence with people who had resources and experience to help her safely deliver her baby and survive until spring's return. The offer represented salvation, but accepting it would mean abandoning her homestead claim. During the critical period when continuous residence was required for legal ownership, Catherine would lose everything Thomas had worked to build, forfeiting their dreams of independent land ownership for temporary safety. The choice between survival and principle created an agonizing dilemma that kept her awake through increasingly cold nights. Catherine's response revealed the depth of her commitment to Thomas's vision and her own growing determination to succeed where others expected her to fail. She thanked Chester for his kindness but declined his offer, explaining that she intended to maintain the homestead through winter, regardless of the challenges involved. Chester's expression showed both admiration and concern as he promised to check on her whenever his route permitted. After Chester departed, Catherine faced the reality that she had committed herself to surviving Montana winter alone while managing childbirth and infant care without assistance. The enormity of this challenge forced her to think beyond conventional homesteading methods toward more creative solutions that might allow her to succeed where traditional approaches would certainly fail. The abandoned dwelling by the creek became increasingly important in Catherine's survival planning. She spent several days exploring the site more thoroughly, discovering construction techniques that seemed perfectly adapted to local climate conditions. The builders had used natural materials in ways that provided insulation, wind protection, and efficient heating that her conventional cabin could not match. Most significantly, Catherine found evidence that the original inhabitants had maintained winter food stores using preservation methods she had never encountered. Underground storage chambers lined with stones and bark contained traces of dried foods that had remained edible for months or even years. The technique suggested knowledge about survival that European homesteading traditions had not developed. For prairie conditions, Catherine began experimenting with these preservation methods, adapting what she could understand to protect her remaining food supplies. She dug storage pits following the patterns she had observed, lining them with materials that would provide protection from moisture and temperature extremes. The work was exhausting for a woman in her condition, But each successful adaptation increased her confidence about surviving winter independently. The baby's movements had become less frequent but more powerful, suggesting that birth was approaching. Within weeks rather than months, Catherine had prepared everything she could for delivery, gathering clean cloth, boiling water containers, and studying medical texts until she had memorized every detail about labor and birth procedures. Yet she knew that intellectual preparation could not substitute for experienced assistance when complications arose. November brought the first serious snowfall, covering the prairie with 6 inches of white that transformed the familiar landscape into something beautiful but alien. Catherine had never experienced winter this far from civilization, and the snow's arrival marked a point of no return in her commitment to homestead survival. Roads would soon become impassable, making evacuation impossible even if she changed her mind about accepting help. The snow also revealed animal tracks around her cabin, showing that wildlife was beginning to move closer to human habitation as natural food sources became scarce. Deer tracks crossed her yard each morning, while rabbit trails crisscrossed between her buildings. Most concerning were the larger prints that might belong to predators seeking easy prey among domestic animals or vulnerable humans. Catherine's chickens required more care as temperatures dropped, forcing her to insulate their co-op and provide additional food to maintain egg production through winter months. The birds represented her most reliable source of protein, making their survival essential for her own. She spent precious energy each day ensuring their shelter remained secure against both weather and predators. The physical demands of winter preparations were becoming impossible for Catherine to manage alone. Simple tasks like chopping firewood, hauling water from the well, left her exhausted and concerned about triggering premature labor. She was learning to work in shorter intervals with frequent rest periods, accepting that efficiency was less important than avoiding injury or medical complications. Catherine's most serious challenge remained the inadequate firewood supply for heating her cabin through Montana's brutal winter. She had attempted to cut additional wood, but lacked both the strength and skill to fell trees safely in her pregnant condition. The work was too dangerous to attempt alone, yet without adequate fuel, the cabin would become uninhabitable within weeks of winter's full arrival. Desperation drove Catherine to explore alternative heating methods that might extend her fuel supply or provide warmth through less conventional means. She experimented with burning dried grass twisted into tight bundles, discovering that prairie vegetation could provide short-term heat when wood was unavailable. She also learned to bank fires more efficiently, maintaining warmth through the night with minimal fuel consumption. The abandoned dwelling by the creek offered additional insights into heating methods adapted to local conditions. The original builders had constructed fire pits with sophisticated ventilation systems that maximized heat output while minimizing fuel requirements. Catherine studied these designs, attempting to adapt their principles to improve her cabin's heating efficiency. As November progressed, Catherine began experiencing irregular contractions that suggested labor might be approaching sooner than her calculations predicted. The sensations were mild but unmistakable, creating urgent pressure to complete her. Winter preparations before the baby's arrival made such work impossible. She felt caught between competing demands that all seemed essential for survival. The first major blizzard struck during the 3rd week of November, bringing winds that howled around her cabin with supernatural fury and snow that piled against her windows like a living thing seeking entrance. Catherine had experienced storms before, but nothing had prepared her for the raw power of Montana winter unleashed across the open prairie. The wind created sounds she had never heard, combining with the storm's darkness to produce an atmosphere of primal terror. During the 3-day blizzard, Catherine discovered how inadequate her preparations really were. The cabin's construction, adequate for summer and autumn weather, proved insufficient against winter's full assault. Wind found every gap in the walls, creating drafts that made heating impossible despite burning precious firewood at an unsustainable rate. Snow forced its way through cracks around windows and doors, melting to create puddles that froze when the wind shifted direction. Most alarmingly, the storm's intensity made checking on her chickens impossible for 2 entire days. When Catherine finally struggled through waist-deep snow to reach their coop, she found that 3 birds had died from cold despite her insulation efforts. The loss reduced her protein sources significantly while demonstrating how quickly winter could destroy her carefully planned survival resources. The blizzard also revealed the extent of her isolation in ways that summer's abundance had concealed. No human tracks appeared in the snow after the storm passed, confirming that she was truly alone in a landscape that offered no mercy for mistakes or miscalculations. The nearest neighbors were too distant to provide assistance, even if they knew about her situation, which they did not. Catherine's physical condition was deteriorating under the combined stress of advanced pregnancy, inadequate nutrition, and constant worry about survival. She had lost weight everywhere except her belly, and her energy levels were dropping to dangerous levels. The baby's movements had become irregular, sometimes active to the point of pain, other times frighteningly still for hours at a time. Medical books Thomas had left provided no guidance for managing pregnancy under frontier survival conditions. Their recommendations assumed adequate nutrition, warm housing, and medical supervision that Catherine lacked completely. She was navigating pregnancy and approaching childbirth based on instinct and determination rather than knowledge or preparation. December's arrival brought temperatures that regularly dropped below zero, creating conditions that tested every aspect of Catherine's survival preparations. Water froze in containers inside her cabin, requiring constant attention to maintain drinking supplies. Her remaining food stores were dwindling faster than anticipated, forcing her to reduce meal portions to stretch supplies through the remaining winter months. The baby was clearly preparing for birth, with Catherine experiencing stronger contractions and physical changes that indicated delivery could occur at any time. She faced the terrifying prospect of labor during the harshest season in one of the continent's most challenging climates, without medical assistance or even another woman to provide guidance and support. Catherine's situation had evolved beyond simple hardship into genuine life-threatening crisis. She was trapped by winter weather in a cabin inadequately prepared for the climate, with food and fuel supplies that would not last until spring, facing childbirth without assistance while her physical condition deteriorated daily. Every choice now carried potentially fatal consequences, and traditional homesteading approaches had proven completely inadequate for her circumstances. The isolation that had once felt like peaceful solitude now pressed against Catherine's sanity like a physical weight. She found herself talking constantly to Thomas's memory, to her unborn child, to anyone who might be listening in the vast emptiness surrounding her cabin. The sound of her own voice became essential for maintaining psychological stability in the overwhelming silence of winter Prairie. Yet even in her desperate circumstances, Catherine began to notice something unexpected in the winter landscape around her. Animal tracks appeared regularly in the snow near her cabin, suggesting that wildlife was not simply enduring winter, but actively moving through the environment in patterns that implied knowledge about resources and shelter she had not discovered. Most intriguingly, Catherine observed that certain areas near the abandoned dwelling by the creek remained more comfortable than others despite identical exposure to wind and cold. The original builders had chosen their location and construction methods based on understanding about microclimate and natural protection that Catherine was only beginning to appreciate. These observations suggested that survival in this environment required different knowledge and techniques than conventional homesteading provided. Someone had succeeded in living comfortably on this land for extended periods, leaving behind evidence of sophisticated adaptation to local conditions. Catherine began to wonder whether her salvation might lie not in enduring winter through sheer determination, But in learning from the people who had understood this landscape before European settlement imposed different approaches, the realization that she needed to think beyond conventional solutions came just as Catherine's physical condition reached a critical point. The baby was clearly preparing for birth within days rather than weeks, while her food and fuel supplies reached levels that would not sustain her much longer. She faced the possibility that she might not survive winter even if she successfully delivered a healthy child. Standing at her cabin window on a clear December morning, watching smoke from her dwindling fire rise straight up in the still air, Catherine made a decision that would either save her life or hasten her death. She would stop trying to survive winter according to homesteading traditions that were proving inadequate, and instead seek to understand the wisdom that had allowed others to thrive in this same environment. The decision required courage that went beyond physical bravery to encompass intellectual humility about her own limitations and cultural assumptions. Catherine would need to abandon approaches that felt familiar and safe in favor of methods she did not understand, guided by evidence left by people she had never met, but whose survival skills might be her salvation. That evening, as another winter storm began building on the horizon, Catherine prepared for a journey that would either connect her with the knowledge she needed to survive, or expose her to dangers that would end her struggle permanently. Baby moved restlessly inside her, as if sensing that their fate would soon be determined by forces beyond the cabin walls, where they had sought shelter but found only temporary refuge. The morning Catherine decided to seek help from the ruins. By the creek, her water broke while she was attempting to stoke the dying embers in her fireplace. The sudden rush of warm fluid soaking through her nightgown brought both relief and terror as she realized that her baby had chosen this moment, in the depths of a Montana winter, to make its entrance into the world. The contractions that followed came fast and strong, nothing like the gentle progression described in the medical books she had studied so desperately. Catherine's first instinct was panic, but Thomas's voice seemed to echo in her mind, reminding her of the practical approach he had always taken to frontier challenges. She gathered clean cloth, heated water on her stove, and arranged her bed, according to the instructions she had memorized from the medical texts. Yet as the contractions intensified, Catherine understood that intellectual preparation meant nothing when facing the raw reality of childbirth, alone in a cabin miles from any human assistance. The labor progressed with frightening intensity, forcing Catherine to abandon her careful preparations as waves of pain demanded all her attention. She found herself moving instinctively around the cabin, seeking positions that provided relief, listening to her body's demands rather than following the medical procedures she had studied. The baby seemed determined to arrive quickly, as if sensing the urgency of their desperate circumstances. By midday, Catherine realized she could not deliver this child safely inside her inadequately heated cabin. The building's temperature had dropped so low that her breath created clouds of vapor, and she knew that a newborn infant could not survive such cold. Desperation drove her to make a decision that defied all conventional wisdom about childbirth. She would seek shelter in the ruins by the creek, where the original construction might provide better protection than her failing homestead cabin. The journey from her cabin to the creek represented the most difficult quarter-mile Catherine had ever traveled. Wearing Thomas's heavy coat over her nightgown and carrying a bundle of essential supplies, she struggled through knee-deep snow, while powerful contractions forced her to stop every few yards. The cold was so intense that her tears froze on her cheeks, but determination driven by maternal instinct kept her moving toward the ancient shelter that might save both their lives. Catherine reached the ruins just as another massive contraction brought her to her knees in the snow. Through her pain, she noticed something that stopped her breath completely. Smoke was rising from the collapsed dwelling, suggesting that someone had taken shelter there recently. Her first thought was fear that she might encounter hostile strangers. But as another contraction gripped her body, Catherine realized she had no choice but to seek help regardless of who might be waiting inside. The voice that called out to her spoke in accented English, mixed with words from a language Catherine did not recognize. But the tone carried immediate concern and invitation rather than threat. A woman emerged from the ruins, moving with confident grace despite the deep snow, and Catherine found herself looking into eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom about survival and birth, and the sacred connections between human life and the natural world. The woman was perhaps 50 years old, with silver streaked through long black hair that was braided with small bones and beads that caught the winter light. Her clothing combined traditional materials with practical adaptations for frontier conditions, creating garments that looked both ancient and perfectly suited for Montana's harsh climate. Most importantly, her hands moved with the assured competence of someone who had delivered many babies under challenging circumstances. "I am Grey Wolf Woman," she said in careful English, already moving to support Catherine's weight as another contraction forced her to double over. "The spirits told me to wait here for someone who would need help bringing new life into this world. You have come at the right time, though the baby seems eager to arrive quickly." Catherine found herself being guided into the ruins, which had been transformed from collapsed shelter into warm, comfortable refuge through modifications she could not have imagined. The space had been enlarged and reinforced with additional materials, creating a structure that maintained comfortable temperature despite the brutal cold outside. A fire burned in a carefully designed hearth that provided maximum heat while eliminating dangerous smoke accumulation. Most remarkably, Grey Wolf Woman had prepared the space specifically for childbirth, arranging soft furs and clean cloth in ways that created a birthing environment superior to anything Catherine could have managed in her cabin. Herbs hung from the ceiling, filling the air with scents that seemed to ease Catherine's pain and anxiety. Everything suggested that this encounter was not accidental, but planned according to knowledge Catherine could not understand. Grey Wolf Woman's approach to childbirth combined traditional, native techniques with practical frontier medicine in ways that immediately proved more effective than Catherine's academic preparation. She brewed teas from plants she carried in leather pouches, creating drinks that eased labor pain while maintaining Catherine's strength. Her hands guided Catherine through breathing techniques and positions that worked with rather than against the natural birth process. "Your body knows how to do this," Grey Wolf Woman explained as she helped Catherine find a squatting position that immediately reduced her pain. "The white man's medicine tries to control birth, but we must work with the baby's spirit and the mother's wisdom. Listen to what your body tells you, and trust that the Creator made women strong enough for this sacred work." Under Grey Wolf Woman's guidance, Catherine discovered that childbirth could be empowering rather than terrifying when approached with proper knowledge and support. The older woman's calm confidence helped Catherine release her fear and focus on the incredible process of bringing new life into the world. Each contraction became productive rather than simply painful, moving them closer to the moment when her baby would finally arrive. The birth itself happened with surprising quickness once Catherine learned to work with her body's natural rhythms rather than fighting against them. Grey Wolf Woman's experienced hands guided the baby into the world with a gentleness that seemed almost miraculous after Catherine's fears about managing delivery alone. The infant emerged healthy and crying, a strong boy whose vigorous protests suggested he would thrive, despite the challenging circumstances of his arrival. Grey Wolf Woman performed the newborn care with ritual precision that transformed practical necessity into sacred ceremony. She cleaned the baby with warm water and soft cloth while speaking words in her own language that seemed to welcome him into the community of living beings. Her treatment of the umbilical cord followed procedures that ensured healing while marking the child's spiritual connection to his mother and the earth that would sustain him. Most importantly, Grey Wolf Woman created immediate bonding between Catherine and her son through techniques that seemed both ancient and perfectly natural. She placed the baby on Catherine's chest while they were still connected, allowing them to experience the first moments of independent life together. The intimacy of this contact helped Catherine's body complete the birth process, while establishing the profound connection that would define their relationship. "He is strong," Grey Wolf woman observed as the baby nursed successfully within minutes of birth. "His spirit chose to come during the hardest season because he knows he can survive anything this world offers." "You have given birth to a winter child, and such children carry special medicine throughout their lives." Catherine felt overwhelming gratitude toward this stranger, who had appeared exactly when needed and provided assistance that meant this difference between life and death for both her and her son. Yet Grey Wolf woman's presence raised questions that Catherine was afraid to ask. How had she known to be waiting at this location? Why had she prepared for childbirth before Catherine arrived? What did she want in return for saving their lives? Grey Wolf woman seemed to understand Catherine's unspoken concerns without taking offense at the suspicion they implied. She explained her presence in terms that challenged Catherine's assumptions about coincidence and providence, while revealing the depth of traditional knowledge about survival and community that European settlement had displaced but not destroyed. "My people lived on this land for many generations before the white homesteaders came with their papers and fences," Grey Wolf woman said as she prepared food for Catherine's recovery. "We did not abandon it when the government moved us to reservations. Some of us remain, watching over the places that are sacred to our ancestors and helping those who need guidance about living properly in this environment." The revelation that Catherine's homestead was located on traditional, native land complicated her understanding of property ownership and legal claims in ways she had never considered. The government had granted her and Thomas the right to claim this quarter section without acknowledging that other people had prior relationships with the land spanning centuries. Grey Wolf woman's presence suggested that those relationships continued despite official policies designed to eliminate them. More immediately, Grey Wolf woman's explanation of her role as a guardian of sacred places offered Catherine hope that her survival crisis might be resolved through knowledge and assistance she could never have imagined. The traditional techniques for winter survival, food preservation, and shelter construction that Catherine had glimpsed in the ruins represented sophisticated adaptation to local conditions developed over countless generations. "Your husband was a good man," Grey Wolf woman continued, somehow knowing about Thomas despite never having met him. "He treated this land with respect and understood that all life is connected. When he died, the spirits told us that his woman would need help to continue his work of caring for this sacred place. We have been watching over you, waiting for the right time to offer assistance." The idea that Catherine had been under spiritual protection during her months of desperate isolation provided comfort while raising new questions about the nature of reality and divine intervention that her traditional Christian upbringing had not prepared her to understand. Grey Wolf woman spoke of spiritual guidance and ancestral wisdom as practical forces in daily life rather than abstract religious concepts. Catherine's recovery from childbirth proceeded smoothly under Grey Wolf woman's care, which combined herbal medicine with nutritional support and physical therapy techniques that proved remarkably effective. The older woman prepared foods that restored Catherine's strength while maintaining milk production for nursing. Her treatment of the birthing process as a sacred transformation, rather than medical emergency, created an atmosphere of celebration rather than crisis. The baby thrived in the warm shelter Grey Wolf woman had created, sleeping peacefully between nursing sessions and showing no signs of distress, despite being born during Montana's harshest weather. Catherine marveled at how different this experience was from the terrifying ordeal she had anticipated, understanding that proper knowledge and support could transform childbirth from life-threatening crisis into empowering spiritual experience. During Catherine's recovery, Grey Wolf woman shared stories about the traditional uses of the land that surrounded their shelter, revealing resources and opportunities that European homesteading methods had overlooked completely. The creek provided more than water. Its banks contained plants that could be harvested for food and medicine throughout the year. The hills offered materials for construction and fuel that did not require cutting trees with axes and saws. Most significantly, Grey Wolf Woman explained how the original inhabitants had maintained permanent settlement on this land through cooperation with natural cycles rather than attempting to impose agricultural patterns developed for different climates and conditions. Their approach to food production, shelter construction, and resource management had created sustainable abundance rather than the struggle for survival that characterized most homestead attempts. The government teaches that Indians are primitive, people who do not know how to use land properly, Grey Wolf Woman observed with gentle irony. But we fed large populations on this prairie for thousands of years without destroying the grasslands or exhausting the soil. Perhaps there is something the white farmers could learn from primitive people about living successfully in this place. Catherine began to understand that her survival crisis had resulted partly from using inappropriate techniques for local conditions, rather than simply from lack of male assistance or inadequate resources. Homesteading methods developed for eastern climates and agricultural conditions had proven inadequate for Montana's prairie environment, where different approaches to food production and shelter might prove more successful. Grey Wolf Woman's offer to teach Catherine traditional survival techniques represented an opportunity to transform her desperate situation into sustainable success. But accepting such help would require abandoning many assumptions about proper ways to live and work on frontier land. Catherine would need to learn from people her culture had taught her to consider primitive while acknowledging that her own supposedly superior methods had nearly killed her. The decision to accept Grey Wolf Woman's assistance came naturally, as Catherine recognized the obvious superiority of traditional techniques over the homesteading approaches that had failed so completely. She asked to learn everything Grey Wolf Woman was willing to teach about surviving and thriving on prairie land, understanding that such knowledge could mean the difference between losing her homestead claim and building the successful future that Thomas had envisioned. Grey Wolf Woman's response revealed that Catherine's request aligned with spiritual guidance she had been receiving about her role in helping newcomers adapt to the land properly. Teaching willing students about traditional knowledge served both practical and spiritual purposes, preserving ancient wisdom while helping good people succeed in building lives that honored rather than destroyed the natural environment. There is much to learn, and winter is a good time for teaching when the land rests and people have time to listen carefully, Grey Wolf Woman said as she prepared to begin Catherine's education in traditional survival techniques. But first, you must understand that learning our ways means accepting that all life is connected, that the land is sacred, and that taking care of the earth means taking care of yourself and your children. Catherine agreed to these principles without fully understanding their implications. Driven by gratitude for the salvation Grey Wolf Woman had provided and practical recognition that traditional knowledge offered her best hope for long-term survival and success, she committed herself to learning whatever Grey Wolf Woman was willing to teach, understanding that her son's future depended on mastering techniques for living successfully on land that demanded respect rather than conquest. The arrangement that emerged from this conversation would transform Catherine's understanding of homesteading, motherhood, and community in ways that went far beyond simple survival techniques. Grey Wolf Woman had appeared at Catherine's moment of greatest need, not just to deliver a baby, but to offer a completely different approach to building life on frontier land that honored both human needs and natural limits. As Catherine held her sleeping son in the warm shelter Grey Wolf Woman had prepared, watching firelight dance across walls that had protected people through countless winters, she felt a profound shift in her understanding of what it meant to make a home in Montana's challenging but magnificent landscape. The education she was about to receive would teach her not just how to survive, but how to thrive in harmony with forces larger than individual human will. The first challenge to Catherine's new way of life came not from nature, but from the very people who should have welcomed her survival. 3 weeks after her son's birth, as she was learning to gather winter medicines under Grey Wolf Woman's patient guidance, the sound of approaching horses shattered the peaceful morning air around their shelter by the creek. Catherine's heart sank as she recognized the riders. Harold Wells had returned, accompanied by Sheriff Daniel Morton and 2 territorial officials, whose presence suggested legal proceedings rather than family concern. Harold's face showed shock and anger as he took in the scene before him. Catherine, dressed in a mixture of her own clothes and traditional garments Grey Wolf Woman had provided for warmth, stood beside their carefully constructed winter shelter, holding a healthy baby while an Assiniboine woman tended their fire with obvious familiarity. The arrangement clearly contradicted every assumption Harold had made about Catherine's inevitable failure and desperate need for his assistance. "Catherine, what in God's name is happening here?" Harold demanded, dismounting with the aggressive movements of someone whose authority had been challenged. "We came expecting to find you dead or dying, and instead we discover you living in some primitive camp with Indians. Have you completely lost your mind?" Sheriff Morton's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon as he observed Grey Wolf Woman, though she showed no signs of hostility or threat. The territorial officials began taking notes with the mechanical efficiency of bureaucrats, documenting violations of regulations they enforced without understanding. Catherine realized immediately that this encounter would test everything she had learned about standing firm in the face of pressure designed to force her into submission. "I am alive and well, as you can see," Catherine replied with calm dignity, refusing to be intimidated by Harold's bluster or the official presence of territorial authority. "My son is healthy, my homestead claim remains valid, and I am fulfilling all legal requirements for continued residence and agricultural productivity." Harold's response revealed the full extent of his frustration with Catherine's refusal to accept his guardianship. He had returned expecting to find her begging for assistance or dead from exposure, either outcome confirming his assertion that women could not survive independently on frontier land. Catherine's obvious health and competence undermined his claims about female incapacity while embarrassing him before territorial officials he had promised would witness her inevitable failure. "You're living with savages in violation of territorial regulations about Indian residents on homestead land," Harold declared, grasping for legal grounds to challenge Catherine's independence. "Federal law prohibits unauthorized native presence on property claimed under homestead provisions. These people must be removed immediately, and you must return to proper Christian housing." Sheriff Morton seemed uncomfortable with Harold's demands, recognizing that Grey Wolf Woman's presence violated no specific laws while serving obvious humanitarian purposes. The territorial officials consulted thick manuals filled with regulations designed to control every aspect of frontier settlement, searching for provisions that might support Harold's claims about unauthorized native residents. Grey Wolf Woman remained silent during these accusations, but her composure carried the dignity of someone whose people had faced such challenges countless times before. Catherine understood that defending her friend and teacher would require courage that went beyond personal survival to encompass principles about justice and human decency that transcended racial prejudice and legal technicalities. "Grey Wolf Woman saved both my life and my child's life when your family abandoned us to die in the wilderness," Catherine said with quiet force that carried across the winter air like a blade. "She has committed no crime except showing Christian charity to people in desperate need. If territorial law prohibits such kindness, then territorial law is morally corrupt and deserves no respect from decent people." The accusation of abandonment struck Harold like a physical blow. forcing him to defend his actions before officials whose judgment could affect his standing in the territorial community. His claim that Catherine had refused reasonable assistance sounded increasingly hollow when confronted with evidence that she had succeeded where he predicted failure, thrived where he expected death, and found help where he offered only manipulation. Sheriff Morton asked Grey Wolf Woman to explain her presence on homestead land, treating her with the respectful attention of someone who recognized competence and dignity, regardless of racial identity. Her response demonstrated sophisticated understanding of legal principles, while revealing the complex relationship between tribal sovereignty and territorial jurisdiction that complicated simple assertions about unauthorized residents. I am a medicine woman among my people, trained to assist in childbirth and healing. Grey Wolf Woman explained in careful English that carried authority despite its accented delivery. When the spirits showed me that a woman would need help bringing new life into this world, I came to offer assistance according to the sacred obligations of my calling. No law prohibits helping those who ask for aid, and no regulation requires abandoning people to suffer when help is available. The territorial officials found themselves faced with a situation their regulations had not anticipated: a Native woman providing essential medical assistance to a white homesteader in circumstances where no alternative help existed. Their manuals contained numerous provisions about controlling Indian movement and residence, but nothing that specifically prohibited life-saving medical intervention during emergencies. Harold grew increasingly frustrated as his legal challenges proved ineffective against the reality of Catherine's success and the obvious legitimacy of Grey Wolf Woman's assistance. His strategy of using official pressure to force Catherine's submission was failing because she had actually succeeded in maintaining her homestead through methods he had never considered possible. Even if this arrangement isn't technically illegal, it's completely inappropriate for a Christian woman. Harold tried a new approach, appealing to social prejudices about racial mixing and proper feminine behavior. Catherine, you're a widow with a newborn child. You need to think about your reputation and your son's future prospects. Living with Indians will mark you as an outcast from decent society. Catherine's response revealed how profoundly her understanding of decency and civilization had changed. Through her experience with Grey Wolf Woman's wisdom and compassion, the traditional social standards Harold invoked seemed hollow compared to the genuine human kindness she had experienced from someone her culture taught her to fear and despise. Grey Wolf Woman has shown me more Christian charity than anyone else since Thomas died, Catherine replied with conviction that surprised everyone present, including herself. She risked her own safety to save strangers, asked nothing in return, and shared knowledge that means the difference between success and failure on this land. If accepting such help makes me an outcast from people who value prejudice over human decency, then I welcome such exile. The moral authority in Catherine's voice impressed even the territorial officials, who recognized genuine conviction when they heard it. Sheriff Morton nodded slightly, acknowledging the strength of her position while respecting her right to make decisions about her own life and property. Harold found himself increasingly isolated as his assumptions about female weakness and racial superiority were challenged by obvious evidence to the contrary. The baby chose that moment to wake and demand attention, crying with the healthy vigor that demonstrated his thriving condition despite being born during Montana's harshest season. Catherine nursed him with the confident competence of a woman who had received proper guidance about infant care, showing none of the desperation Harold had expected from an isolated widow struggling to manage motherhood alone. Grey Wolf Woman used the opportunity to demonstrate her knowledge about child care and medical treatment, explaining how traditional techniques could address common infant ailments that often proved fatal when proper care was unavailable. Her expertise clearly exceeded what any frontier settlement could provide, making her assistance valuable rather than primitive as Harold's prejudices suggested. The territorial officials began asking Grey Wolf Woman detailed questions about Traditional medical knowledge, recognizing potential value in techniques that might supplement inadequate frontier healthcare. Their interest in learning from her expertise contradicted Harold's claims about native inferiority while suggesting that cooperation rather than exclusion might serve territorial development better. Sheriff Morton addressed the core legal issues with practical directness that cut through Harold's emotional manipulation and bureaucratic complexity. Catherine's homestead claim remained valid as long as she maintained continuous residence and met agricultural productivity requirements. Her methods for achieving these goals were her own business unless they violated specific territorial laws, which they did not. Mrs. Wells has fulfilled all legal obligations for homestead maintenance, Morton concluded after reviewing the relevant regulations. Her living arrangements may be unconventional, but they violate no territorial statutes and appear to serve legitimate purposes related to medical care and agricultural assistance. Unless you can demonstrate specific legal violations, this matter falls outside official jurisdiction. Harold's final attempt to challenge Catherine's independence focused on her ability to maintain agricultural productivity through winter months, claiming that cooperation with Indians could not substitute for proper farming techniques required under homestead law. The challenge forced Catherine to demonstrate the success of traditional methods. Grey Wolf woman had taught her for food production and resource management. Catherine led the group to areas where she had implemented traditional techniques for winter food storage and preservation, showing supplies that would sustain her household through the remaining cold months, while providing surplus for trade or emergency assistance. The abundance contradicted Harold's predictions about inevitable starvation, while demonstrating the superiority of traditional methods over conventional homesteading approaches. Grey Wolf woman explained the agricultural principles underlying these techniques, describing sustainable approaches to land use that maintained productivity without exhausting soil resources or destroying natural ecosystems. Her knowledge impressed the territorial officials, who recognized potential applications for improving homestead success rates throughout the territory. The storage methods Catherine had learned included techniques for preserving meat, vegetables, and medicinal plants that European homesteading traditions had not developed for prairie conditions. Underground caches lined with natural materials maintained consistent temperatures while protecting stored foods from weather and pests. Traditional drying and smoking methods created concentrated nutrition that occupied minimal storage space, while providing essential nutrients through winter months. Most significantly, Grey Wolf woman had taught Catherine to work with natural cycles rather than against them, timing food gathering and preservation activities to maximize nutritional value while minimizing labor requirements. These techniques allowed single individuals or small families to achieve food security that conventional farming often failed to provide even with larger households and more extensive equipment. Harold found himself forced to acknowledge that Catherine had achieved agricultural productivity superior to many established homesteads in the region, using methods he had never seen before but could not deny were effective. His claims about her inevitable failure looked increasingly foolish when confronted with obvious evidence of success achieved through approaches he had dismissed as primitive. The territorial officials requested detailed information about traditional agricultural techniques, recognizing potential applications for improving homestead success rates while reducing conflicts with native populations over land use. They began discussing possibilities for formal cooperation between territorial authorities and tribal knowledge holders, acknowledging that traditional expertise might benefit European settlement rather than threatening it. Sheriff Morton expressed interest in learning more about traditional medical techniques that might supplement inadequate frontier healthcare, particularly regarding childbirth and infant care in remote locations where professional medical assistance was unavailable. Grey Wolf woman's successful management of Catherine's delivery demonstrated capabilities that could save lives throughout the territory. Harold realized that his attempt to discredit Catherine had instead elevated her status, while demonstrating the value of cooperation he had tried to prevent. The territorial officials were treating her as a successful homesteader whose techniques deserved study rather than a desperate widow requiring rescue. His strategy had backfired completely, strengthening Catherine's position while undermining his own credibility. The confrontation ended with Harold's reluctant departure after failing to find legal grounds for challenging Catherine's homestead claim or forcing her acceptance of his guardianship. The territorial officials departed with promises to investigate possibilities for formal cooperation between traditional knowledge holders and territorial agricultural programs. Sheriff Morton left with increased respect for Catherine's determination and Gray Wolf Woman's contributions to frontier survival. Catherine watched Harold's wagon disappear into the distance with profound relief, mixed with recognition that she had passed a crucial test of her commitment to the new life she was building, standing firm against family pressure and official intimidation had required courage she had not known she possessed, while defending Gray Wolf Woman had demonstrated principles that went beyond personal survival to encompass justice and human dignity. The confrontation had also revealed how dramatically her understanding of civilization and progress had changed through her relationship with Gray Wolf Woman. Traditional knowledge that her culture dismissed as primitive had proved superior to conventional approaches in every practical application. People her society taught her to fear had shown greater kindness and wisdom than family members who claimed to represent Christian values. Gray Wolf Woman's response to the challenge had demonstrated the dignity and strength that enabled her people to survive centuries of persecution while maintaining their cultural integrity and spiritual wisdom. Her willingness to face official scrutiny for helping Catherine showed commitment to principles that transcended racial boundaries and legal technicalities. That evening, as they prepared their meal using foods preserved through traditional techniques Gray Wolf Woman had taught her, Catherine reflected on how completely her life had been transformed through learning to work with rather than against the natural environment. The abundance surrounding them contradicted everything she had been taught about the difficulty of frontier survival, while demonstrating possibilities she had never imagined. The baby thrived in their warm shelter, growing stronger each day under care that combined the best aspects of traditional and modern approaches to infant health. Catherine's recovery from childbirth had proceeded smoothly through herbal treatments and nutritional support that proved more effective than anything available in frontier towns with limited medical resources. Most importantly, Catherine had discovered community and purpose that gave meaning to survival beyond simple endurance. Working with Gray Wolf Woman to preserve traditional knowledge, while adapting it for changing conditions, created a sense of mission that connected personal success with larger purposes about cultural preservation and environmental stewardship. The test Harold had intended to demonstrate, Catherine's failure had instead proved her transformation from dependent widow into competent homesteader whose success challenged conventional assumptions about gender roles, racial relationships, and appropriate methods for frontier development. She had not merely survived winter childbirth and family abandonment. She had thrived through embracing wisdom her culture had taught her to reject. Spring arrived on the Montana prairie with a gentleness that seemed to celebrate Catherine's survival through the harsh winter that had nearly claimed her life. As snowmelt filled the creek with rushing water and green shoots pushed through the warming earth, Catherine stood outside the shelter that had become her true home, holding her 4-month-old son while watching Gray Wolf Woman prepare for her departure to rejoin her people for the summer gathering season. The woman who had saved Catherine's life could not stay permanently on homestead land, despite the bonds that had formed between them during their months of shared struggle and learning. Tribal obligations called Gray Wolf Woman back to her community, where her skills as a medicine woman were needed for the ceremonies and healing work that marked the renewal of life each spring. Yet her departure would not end the transformation she had begun in Catherine's understanding of survival, community, and purpose. Catherine had learned far more than practical techniques for frontier living during their winter together. Gray Wolf Woman had shared a complete worldview that honored the connections between all forms of life, teaching Catherine to see her homestead not as property to be conquered, but as a sacred trust requiring careful stewardship. This perspective had transformed Catherine's relationship with the land from struggle into partnership, creating abundance where she had once faced scarcity. The knowledge Gray Wolf Woman had shared would remain with Catherine forever, embedded in daily practices that honored traditional wisdom while meeting the legal requirements of homestead law. Catherine had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated weather changes, animal movements, and seasonal transitions that governed successful life on the prairie. She understood which plants provided food and medicine throughout the year, how to preserve surplus resources for lean periods, and how to work with natural cycles rather than against them. Most importantly, Catherine had discovered her own strength and competence in ways that went far beyond simple survival skills. Defending Gray Wolf Woman against Harold's prejudice and official suspicion had required courage Catherine had not known she possessed, while standing firm in her commitment to traditional methods had demonstrated principles that transcended personal convenience or social acceptance. The baby who had been born during Montana's harshest season was thriving under care that combined the best aspects of traditional and modern approaches to infant health. Little James, named for Thomas, but destined to grow up understanding both European and native perspectives on life, represented the future that Catherine was building through cooperation rather than conquest, respect rather than exploitation. Gray Wolf Woman's final gift to Catherine was not another practical technique, but a spiritual understanding that would guide her decisions for the rest of her life. Standing beside the creek where Catherine had found salvation during her darkest hour, the medicine woman spoke words that carried the weight of centuries of wisdom about living properly on the earth. "You have learned to listen to the land, and now the land will teach you everything you need to know," Gray Wolf Woman said, as she prepared her traveling bundle with the careful attention of someone accustomed to carrying only essential possessions. "Trust what the earth tells you about seasons and growth, and the proper time for all activities. Trust what your heart tells you about treating all life with respect. Trust what your experience tells you about the strength that comes from working with rather than against the forces that sustain us." Catherine's gratitude toward Gray Wolf Woman went beyond simple appreciation for life-saving assistance to encompass recognition that she had received education more valuable than anything European schools could provide. The traditional knowledge she had gained would serve her throughout her life while connecting her to wisdom traditions that honored rather than destroyed the natural world. The network of relationships Gray Wolf Woman had introduced Catherine to would continue supporting her success long after the medicine woman's departure. Other tribal members would visit periodically to trade, share information, and maintain the connections that ensured survival through cooperation rather than isolation. Catherine had become part of a community that transcended racial boundaries and legal jurisdictions, united by commitment to living properly on the land. Catherine's homestead had been transformed from struggling frontier outpost into model of sustainable agriculture that demonstrated possibilities for successful settlement without environmental destruction. The techniques she had learned produced more food with less labor while improving rather than depleting soil resources. Her methods attracted attention from neighboring homesteaders seeking alternatives to conventional approaches that often resulted in crop failure and land abandonment. Sheriff Morton became a regular visitor to Catherine's homestead, bringing news from the outside world while learning traditional techniques that could benefit other settlers struggling with frontier challenges. His respect for Catherine's achievements and Gray Wolf Woman's knowledge had evolved into advocacy for cooperation between territorial authorities and tribal wisdom holders, creating possibilities for reducing conflicts while improving settlement success rates. The territorial officials who had investigated Harold's complaints returned several times to document traditional agricultural and medical techniques that might be adapted for broader application throughout Montana Territory. Their reports, too. Territorial administrators emphasized the practical value of indigenous knowledge, while recommending policy changes that would encourage cooperation rather than conflict between native peoples and European settlers. Catherine's success story spread throughout the region, inspiring other women facing similar challenges, while demonstrating that female homesteaders could succeed when provided with appropriate knowledge and support. Her methods attracted particular attention from widows and single women seeking alternatives to dependency on male relatives who might exploit their vulnerability for personal gain. The correspondence Catherine received from women throughout the Western Territories revealed that her experience with family abandonment and subsequent independence resonated with countless others facing similar situations. Her willingness to learn from native peoples had provided solutions that conventional homesteading approaches could not offer, creating a model for success that challenged assumptions about proper methods for frontier development. Harold Wells made one final attempt to reclaim Catherine's homestead during the summer of 1890, arriving with a lawyer and new legal documents that challenged her agricultural productivity claims. However, Catherine's obvious success and the territorial officials' support for her methods made his case impossible to argue convincingly. The abundance evident on her property contradicted every assertion about female incapacity or primitive methods. The confrontation with Harold provided Catherine with an opportunity to demonstrate how completely her understanding of strength and independence had evolved since her desperate winter months. She faced his challenges with calm confidence, supported by documented evidence of agricultural success and community respect that made his claims seem petty and vindictive rather than legitimate concerns about family welfare. Catherine's response to Harold's final legal challenge revealed the depth of her transformation from dependent widow seeking family protection into confident homesteader defending her own achievements. She had learned to value her own judgment over others' opinions while maintaining principled commitments that honored both human relationships and environmental stewardship. The baby who had been born during the winter crisis was walking by the time Harold made his final attempt to reclaim the homestead, toddling around the property with the confident curiosity of a child who had never known hunger or fear. James represented the future Catherine was building through courage and cooperation, growing up with understanding of both European and native approaches to living successfully on the land. Gray Wolf Woman returned for a brief visit during the autumn of 1890, bringing news of her people and checking on Catherine's continued success with traditional methods. Her satisfaction with Catherine's progress reflected recognition that their winter partnership had achieved its intended purpose of preserving valuable knowledge while helping a deserving person build a sustainable life. The reunion between Catherine and Gray Wolf Woman demonstrated how their relationship had evolved from teacher and student into genuine friendship based on mutual respect and shared commitment to living properly on the earth. Catherine's mastery of traditional techniques had developed to the point where she could teach others, extending Gray Wolf Woman's influence beyond their personal relationship. Catherine had also begun documenting traditional knowledge in written form, creating records that could preserve valuable techniques while making them accessible to others, seeking alternatives to conventional homesteading approaches. Her writing combined practical instructions with philosophical insights about the importance of working with rather than against natural systems. The homestead that had nearly claimed Catherine's life during her first winter alone had become a demonstration site where successful sustainable agriculture attracted visitors from throughout the territory. Catherine's willingness to share knowledge, freely created a network of relationships that ensured mutual support during challenging periods, while advancing techniques that benefited entire communities. By 1891, Catherine's homestead had achieved full legal ownership under territorial law, while exceeding productivity requirements through methods that improved rather than depleted natural resources. Her success validated traditional knowledge while challenging assumptions about appropriate methods for frontier development, creating precedents that influenced territorial policies toward indigenous peoples and sustainable agriculture. Catherine's personal transformation from abandoned pregnant widow into respected homesteader and teacher represented more than individual achievement. Her story demonstrated possibilities for cooperation between different cultures and knowledge systems, while showing how apparent disadvantages could become sources of strength when approached with courage and openness to learning. The child who had been born under Gray Wolf woman's care during the sacred sky of a Montana winter was growing up bilingual in English and Assiniboine, bicultural in European and Native traditions, and committed to honoring the connections between human welfare and environmental health. James represented the future that Catherine was building through her choices to embrace, rather than reject the wisdom offered by people her culture had taught her to fear. Standing in her thriving garden during the harvest season of 1891, watching her son play while surrounded by abundance created through traditional techniques, Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperation to fulfillment. The pregnant widow who had been abandoned on the prairie had discovered that salvation came not from those who shared her blood, but from those who recognized the sacred in her struggle. The Assiniboine midwife who had delivered Catherine's baby under the sacred sky had given her far more than medical assistance. Gray Wolf woman had provided a complete education in living properly on the earth, while demonstrating that true civilization measured itself through kindness rather than conquest, cooperation rather than domination, and respect for all life rather than exploitation of the vulnerable. Catherine's homestead had become a bridge between worlds, demonstrating that traditional knowledge and modern needs could work together to create abundance for all. Her success story challenged every assumption about female weakness, racial inferiority, and primitive methods, while proving that the most powerful transformations often began with the courage to accept help from unexpected sources. The baby born during Montana's harshest season had grown into a healthy child who would carry forward the lessons Catherine had learned about survival, community, and the sacred connections that sustain all life. James would grow up understanding that strength came from working with rather than against the forces of nature, and that true security came from relationships built on mutual respect rather than domination. Catherine Wells had discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the greatest challenges, and that salvation often arrives through the very people society teaches us to fear. Her story proved that courage combined with humility could transform desperation into abundance, isolation into community, and survival into purpose that honored the sacred in everyday life. The pregnant widow abandoned on the prairie had found her destiny, not through conquering the wilderness, but through learning to live in harmony with it, guided by the wisdom of an Assiniboine midwife who understood that bringing new life into the world was always a sacred act worthy of celebration under the endless Montana sky. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.